Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we're tackling what is honestly one of the most profound and, frankly, fiercely debated mysteries in all of science, the origins of life. I mean, how exactly did we get from a completely lifeless rock floating in space to the incredibly complex, just breathtaking biological systems that we see today? It's a question that sparked intense debate for decades now. So, we're going to unpack the cutting-edge arguments on both sides of this divide, and we're doing it with complete objectivity. We'll look directly at the data, the sharp critiques, and the mainstream scientific responses. We're laying it all out clearly so you can understand exactly where the origin of life debate stands right now. Let's get into it.
Okay, here's our roadmap for today. First up, we'll look at the spark of life. Then we'll examine a major chemistry critique in a section called Life Can't Start, followed right by the genetic hurdles in Life Can't Hold. Fourth, we'll look at how mainstream science pushes back. And finally, we'll wrap the whole thing up with the role of assumptions.
All right, Section 1. The Spark of Life, the 1952 experiment.
So this is the classic foundation you probably remember from your high school biology class. Back in 1952, scientists Stanley Miller and Harold Urey built this sealed glass apparatus. They pumped it full of water, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen, basically gases that were meant to mimic the early Earth. And then they shocked it with electrical sparks to simulate lightning. And amazingly, it worked. They actually produced amino acids, which are the basic building blocks of proteins. Now, for decades after this huge breakthrough, this result was taught almost like it was the opening chapter of a completely solved problem. Scientists had shown that life's raw materials could literally assemble themselves. The rest, well, everyone just assumed it was only a matter of time. But here we are over 70 years later, and instead of closing the book on this, origin of life research has actually become a receding target. The closer we look at it, the harder the problem gets.
Moving on to Section 2. Life Can't Start. Chemistry. Subtitle here is James Tour's Challenge.
To really understand the modern critiques, we need to talk about James Tour. He's a highly credentialed organic synthesis specialist at Rice University. We're talking over 130 patents and hundreds of peer-reviewed publications. Definitely not a fringe figure. As a working chemist, looking at the actual current state of his field, he points out a pretty glaring issue. Those famous amino acids from the Miller-Urey experiment, they're really only one of at least 4 separate classes of building blocks that life absolutely requires. You also need sugars, you need nucleobases, and you need phosphate-based backbones. And Tour argues that right now, not a single one of these 4 has a demonstrated, non-designed pathway to simply form on its own in nature, let alone somehow link together in the incredibly precise sequence required for life.
And this brilliantly illustrates why that original 1952 soup is viewed by critics as a bit of a messy dead end. When you create these molecules using unguided chemistry in a lab, you get what's called a racemic mixture. That's just a fancy way of saying a roughly 50-50 mix of left-handed and right-handed molecules. But here's the catch. Every single living system on Earth uses only one-handedness exclusively. It's kind of like trying to build a house, but your factory is just randomly turning out left-threaded and right-threaded screws, and you could only use one type. Ordinary, unguided chemistry just has no mechanism to sort them out. Literally nothing about ordinary chemistry explains this incredible, exclusive selectivity.
Which brings us to Tour's ultimate summary metaphor. He says that the better biochemistry understands the actual, staggering complexity of a living cell, the further away an undirected chemical origin looks. It's not getting closer, it's receding. The pure chemistry required to jump from a messy, reactive soup to a highly ordered, single-handed, information-rich cell is just a massive hurdle. And according to Tour, 70-plus years of intense research remains nowhere close to actually solving it. Which brings us to Section 3, Life Can't Hold Genetics. Subtitle, The Code Degradation.
Now, even if we were to completely set aside that chemistry problem of starting life, geneticist Robert Carter introduces another massive hurdle, this time regarding how you maintain it. I really want you to think about this paradox for a second. How do you build DNA without a cell, and how do you build a cell without DNA? Carter frames this as the pure chicken and egg paradox. You see, DNA's backbone depends on phosphate, but phosphate bonds break down way faster than random chemistry can form them. DNA requires a living, fully functioning cell to build it, to repair it, and to read it. But that living cell requires the instructions from the DNA to even exist in the first place. So what came first when both are absolutely essential to the other? This brings us to a pivotal concept called genetic entropy. This is the theory that a genetic code degrades constantly through ordinary chemistry over time.
The core idea here is that DNA isn't just incredibly hard to build, it's also incredibly difficult to maintain. Why? Because the natural, everyday forces of chemistry are constantly trying to break it down.
So the crucial point is perfectly demonstrated by cytosine. That's one of DNA's 4 fundamental bases. Cytosine is so incredibly chemically reactive that it requires continuous, dedicated cellular repair machinery just to stop it from converting into a completely different, incorrect base. It's wild. But even with all these repair systems running at absolute maximum capacity, mutations inevitably slip through. Carter's argument is that the vast majority of these mutations are either neutral or mildly harmful. Finding genuinely new, beneficial information is the rare exception. Over time, he argues, this means the genome is actually fragmenting and degrading rather than building up new complexity.
All right, section 4, mainstream science pushes back, new frameworks and rebuttals. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how mainstream science pushes back. Because science is a rigorous dialogue, right? Mainstream researchers certainly haven't just been standing still since 1952. They have very robust frameworks and rebuttals to address these exact critiques. We've moved way past that old soup chemistry of lightning and early Earth gases. Today, mainstream science is looking at much more sophisticated mechanisms. For example, take the RNA-world hypothesis. This elegantly tackles that chicken and egg problem we just talked about by proposing that RNA could have actually served double duty early on, both storing information like DNA and catalyzing reactions like proteins. Then you have the hydrothermal vents model, championed by researchers like Nick Lane. This proposes that alkaline vents at the very bottom of the ocean could have supplied the necessary energy, the natural proton gradients, and the mineral scaffolding for early life, and that would completely bypass the need for lightning strikes and atmospheric gases altogether. And honestly, we can't forget the skies above us either. Meteoritic evidence, specifically from the famous Murchison meteorite, has actually revealed organic molecules hidden inside carbonaceous space rocks. We're talking amino acids and even nucleobases. This strongly suggests to mainstream researchers that some of this vital prebiotic chemistry didn't even have to be built from scratch on a harsh early Earth. It very well may have been seeded directly from space.
Furthermore, population geneticists push back incredibly hard against this whole concept of genetic entropy. They cite very specific mechanisms that naturally combat this alleged degradation. First off, purifying selection is highly efficient at just removing mildly harmful mutations from a population. Second, genetic recombination during reproduction constantly reshuffles the genetic deck, which can really slow down or even completely offset the accumulation of those bad mutations. And finally, we actually have documented evidence of gene duplication, where genomes literally gain measurable new functional complexity over time. A great example of this is the expansion of our own immune gene families. So these experts argue that genomes are absolutely not just uniformly running down.
Moving to our final section, section 5, the role of assumptions, reading the data.
This is where we need to kind of zoom out and look at how science actually operates when it's faced with this level of incredible complexity. What we have here are 2 very different lenses viewing the exact same data. On one side, a created information model predicts the exact pattern Carter points to, a highly functional genetic code, front-loaded with information that's now steadily degrading over a shorter timeline. Conversely, the standard evolutionary model accommodates this exact same data, but differently. It posits that early chemistry somehow managed to cross a complex threshold that we just can't replicate in a lab yet, and that beneficial mutations accumulated fast enough over deep geological time to basically outrun any ongoing genetic decay. Keep in mind, both models are looking at the exact same universe.
And really, this is the ultimate takeaway for you from this explainer. The data is real, the chemical hurdles are real, and the genetic mutations are real. But what that data is actually allowed to mean, well, that depends heavily on the foundational assumptions you bring to reading it. Both halves of this argument, a chemistry that won't easily start and a genetic code that won't easily hold, are live, highly contested, deeply technical questions. They are absolutely not settled on either side. So, what does this all mean, and where does it leave us? Well, it leaves us staring right at the fossil record. If the origin of life is this heavily contested, what happens when complex life just suddenly bursts onto the scene? In our next explainer, we're going to look at the fossil record's most sudden, dramatic burst of new life, the Cambrian explosion. Does the evidence look more like a slow, evolutionary branching tree, or does it look more like a starting gun going off? I absolutely can't wait to share that with you. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and thank you so much for joining me.